Welcome to the DC Now podcast. My name is Rose.
I'm Tasha.
And we're here with Lisa Sales from Virginia Now to talk about the ERA. Thank you, Lisa, for coming to our podcast. First, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm happy to. Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here, especially to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. My name is Lisa Sales. I'm the president of the Virginia National Organization for Women. And I was one of the leaders in the fight at VA Ratify ERA to make Virginia the final and 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment.
So could you explain what the Equal Rights Amendment is to those who don't know?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I also want to add, because it frames my perspective a lot, that I sit on the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance Policy Committee and am a sexual assault survivor. And that is in part what brought me to the fight, along with equal pay. And so with that in mind, the ERA was introduced 100 years ago, written by Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman. Little known, maybe better known women now, but certainly not folks we often read about in our history books. And their hope was that all people, and women in particular, should have ordinary equality. They couldn't fathom that we were being treated as second-class citizens. We didn't have the right to vote. And when we were granted, some say nothing was granted, it was blood, sweat, and tears. But when we were granted the right to vote vis-a-vis the 19th Amendment, is really the first time women, without mentioning the word women, were put into the Constitution and given the ability to vote. But we know that some women, particularly women of color, were still not allowed to vote without literacy tests and counting bubbles on a soap bar, and counting jelly beans in a jar, guessing jelly beans in a jar, or having folks vouch for them in effort to vote. And so there was a big parade in Washington way back when, and unfortunately, women of color were asked to walk in the back of the parade, which is horrible to think about today or any day. But the Equal Rights Amendment itself has 3 sections, but the primary text of the ERA is really 24 powerful words, and all it says is equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. Doesn't even say the word women. And it applies to any gender. So women, LGBTQIA, it's for everyone. It's about gender equality and leveling the playing field. It's a principle about equality that would be enshrined in our Constitution.
I guess I can ask 2 questions.
Sure.
How would passing the ERA directly impact the lives of women? And is it necessary, given that women are given legal protections under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
Yes, so that's a good question. I appreciate the question. Women have made tremendous advances. That's true. But we are still second-class citizens. And we oftentimes don't have constitutional teeth to back up those laws. Whether it's Title VII or Title IX or the Equal Pay Act, pregnancy discrimination, the Violence Against Women Act, we saw that it sat languishing for a while without reauthorization. And so these laws can be rolled back, as we've seen with Roe, because it wasn't in the text of a constitutional amendment, right? It wasn't textual or originalist. If you hear folks use those terms, textual or originalist, it means it wasn't explicitly stated in the law. It was implied or implicit. And so if you don't have constitutional backing or undergirding for all of these laws, it's not as strong. These laws are not as strong as they could be. and they are subject to a legislator's whims and can be rolled back at any time. And so today we still don't have equal pay. Today, there are still something like, I think we finally reached 25%, maybe still a little bit less, American CEOs are women. We still don't have paid family medical leave in many states. We see women are still the poorest of the poor in this country. Many of them heads of household, single mothers with children, and it's hard to make a living, and especially when you don't have the same earnings as men, and you are forced to then in the end your retirement package is also not as large as it could be, and it's hard to grow wealth. So there are so many reasons, notwithstanding sexual assault, domestic violence, sexual harassment in the workplace, our inability to speak out in the workplace without fear of losing our jobs. I know firsthand experience because I was sexually assaulted in 2011 and was in the court system through 2018 and have not stopped fighting since, and was invited by Yahoo News to tell my story.
Wow.
About 18, 20 months ago, and was fired for stepping out to tell my story of sexual assault. We can't allow those things. And these are some of the things that, just some of the things that the ERA could possibly help strengthen and offer protections for.
Wow. This is Tasha. I commend your strength, and I'm that's that's a powerful story. It's very, I really appreciate you sharing that. I wondered, what's the state of the ERA today? Like, is there need for membership, or what's the state of it today? What is needed from other women or support?
Yes, thank you. Well, so the status is Article 5 of the Constitution requires that 38 states ratify after it's approved by Congress. It's sent to the states must ratify. And once they ratify, it is supposed to be published in the Federal Register, certified by the archivist, and become the law of the land. As with all things women, and even all things amendments, our American constitutional amendment process has been messy, not just for the Equal Rights Amendment. The last amendment to be published to the U.S. Constitution concerning congressional pay raises was the 27th Amendment. And it was, when it was published, it was 203 years old. They often call it the Madison Amendment because that's when it was introduced. So we're hoping that we don't have to wait another 103 years for the ERA. And so where we stand right now is a federal appellate court decision came down on Tuesday of last week that basically tossed the ERA back to Congress. It really said there's no role for the courts. The states don't have standing, which is a legal term to say that they haven't been harmed or haven't proven they've been harmed by not having the ERA published in the Constitution. And that case was to force the archivist to complete now her ministerial duty, really secretarial duty, to merely publish an amendment once it was once it was duly ratified by all the requisite states. And so there's a resolution in Congress, much like with the 27th Amendment, which the archivist at the time went ahead and published. And then afterwards, Congress was embarrassed and came back and affirmed or validated the amendment, the 27th Amendment, concerning congressional pay. We are hoping that Congress can do the same here, that they can affirm or validate the amendment. And there are resolutions in both chambers to essentially lift the deadline, lift the time limit. We like to call it the time limit because it is not dead. The ERA is alive and well and kicking. We just need more bipartisan support. And funny little thing about that is the ERA was actually introduced by the Republicans, not the Democrats. An equal pay law was introduced by the Republicans and not the Democrats. But you asked a great question, and that's what can people do? I don't think this president, I don't think this Congress is hearing us shout from the mountaintops how much we need ERA. Until there's enough demand for it and there's a groundswell of voices, a cacophony, if you will, people aren't going to sit up and pay attention. We just hit primetime news again, I think, first time in a while since Virginia ratified, and certainly since the 70s and beginning of the 80s when Gloria Steinem, Ellie Smeal, and Phyllis Schlafly, were working on or against the ERA. And on Sunday, we were featured on ABC News this week with George Stephanopoulos. There was a good piece. So that was exciting to see that this 100th anniversary year, the centennial year of the ERA, that we are finally, again, getting some traction. But it takes every one of us, and we need to do better as now leaders, amplifying each other's tweets, making sure to educate women of all ages and all backgrounds about why the ERA is so important to them. We need to do a better job of regularly calling our members of Congress, of regularly communicating with the White House and the White House Gender Policy Council to demand that the ERA is enshrined in the Constitution once and for all.
Well, how do you think that women can get more involved in helping to pass the ERA? And then my specific thought would be like, especially our young women, college bound, even high school senior. But what are some of your suggestions to get women involved in helping pass that ERA?
Yeah, well, we all have to talk about it and educate youth group, although they're more advanced than we are, and they don't take any poop, if you will. Excuse the technical term, the importance of gender equality. But there's many that don't understand. For example, I was invited to be a judge of high school and junior high school students, kind of like a debate club kind of civics thing where they argue cases before you and then you judge them. At the end, you determine who wins and what ranking they get as a result of their ability to argue a case. And it shocked me that people really think the ERA is this old dusty relic. Even some of our youngsters are very advanced and know more than some of the older ladies or the middle-aged ladies. But many showed me that they didn't have a clue about the ERA, or if they did, they thought it was something old and dusty and didn't understand how it might apply to them. And they didn't realize that on account of sex, the word sex means all genders. They thought it meant only women. So I think it's important that we talk to each other, that we lift this up constantly in every conversation. And again, importantly, I want to reiterate the importance, but that is how critical it is, to call the White House, call the White House Gender Policy Council, call and write to your members of Congress, tag them on social media, create media posts. That's the only way we have to lift this up. Talk to reporters if you have the opportunity. Tell them why it's important, particularly in light of Roe, abortion medication. Our rights every day are being rolled back. If you can't speak out about what's happening to you, whether it's sexual harassment or sexual assault, and you get fired, think about this for a minute. You get fired, just for telling your story, where's the humanity? This is a human rights issue. And I think we all need to be out there in full force fighting for it, not just at the women's marches, because sometimes the Equal Rights Amendment gets drowned out there. And I don't think sometimes even the folks running the women's marches are aware of the significance of the ERA and how it really undergirds everything. Someone I know said to me, you know, this ERA thing, why aren't you just helping me with my menstrual equity project? I said, well, I am working on that and supporting you with that. But what you're missing is that the Equal Rights Amendment undergirds is the foundation. Think of it as the scaffolding for all things to be built. If you think of a building, right? The ERA is essential for anything that has to do with women's rights, with human rights, with one's dignity, with racial justice, with economic justice, all the core issues that we fight for at the National Organization for Women. And it's been sort of the basis of NOW's work since 1966. And do more things like you're doing now, hold podcasts and share it and amplify the message.
Well, I'm sorry, can't President Biden direct the archivist to publish the ERA, or what can President Biden do? Is he able to direct that?
So that's a bit of a controversial question. And the White House Office of Legal Counsel, or the DOJ Office of Legal Counsel, and White House Legal Counsel, and maybe even the president himself as a constitutional scholar, would say Article 5 of the Constitution gives no role to the executive in the amending process. And he's not wrong. It's not explicitly stated in the Constitution. All the Constitution says is in Article 5 is that 2/3 of Congress must pass the amendment, send it to the states, 38 states, 38 of 50, must ratify, and then it becomes the law of the land. It gives no role to the courts really either. That said, President Biden could be using his bully pulpit to talk more about the ERA, and we need to ask him to do that and put a lot of pressure on him to do so. The other thing is, while saying there's no role for the executive, means for him not to put his thumb on the scale if that's what the administration truly believes. Now, let me step back to, I believe it was 1978. I think it was October of 1978, but somebody can correct me. President Carter was not required to sign an extension, a resolution from Congress that extended the time limit on the ERA. There was no role, to President Biden's point, for the president. But in fact, President Carter decided that he wanted a role, and though not required, that he felt so strongly about the Equal Rights Amendment that he wished to sign the resolution that extended the time limit on the ERA for 3 years. And so we need that kind of attention to the ERA. We need the president to use his platform. And what I started to say that I didn't finish is that if you're going to request an opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel, which the Trump administration did as well, and the Trump administration's Office of Legal Counsel said one thing, and the Biden administration's Office for Legal Counsel said yet another thing. And so we know that these are opinions, and opinions change depending on the administration and the person writing the opinion, the time period, the frame of mind, and they are merely advisory. And so if the president is going to ask the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel, often referred to for short as OLC, that the president is involved and has some role by his action or inaction in requesting an opinion, first. Secondly, by not allowing or telling the archivist of the United States not to publish, that's also having a role. Whether it's commission or omission, the president is having a role in this process, whether it's outlined in Article 5 of the Constitution. And so if President Biden or any other president wants to leave it up to Congress, and I think we have precedent for that, that Congress can make deadlines, remove deadlines, extend deadlines, or time limits, then they can do it again. If there's just the political will to give over half this population the equal rights and equal standing, equal protection under the law. And I think we need to demand that this president use his voice to support women. I mean, he's the VAWA president, right? The Violence Against Women Act. He was the author of that. And he needs to put his money where his mouth is and support women, support the voters, which are predominantly women across the country, who elevated him into that seat and trusted him to do more with the ERA. And to date, we're not hearing a lot from this president about the Equal Rights Amendment, other than at times he's rolled out, and not even this month, right? It's Women's History Month. We're at the beginning of Women's History Month, so happy Women's History Month to everyone. But there was no mention of the ERA in the White House statement. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I'm told there's been no statement on the ERA. Last year there was. Last year was also the 2-year anniversary of Virginia's becoming the final and 38th state, requisite state needed to ratify the amendment. And he did come out with a statement. And we stood outside like the suffragists once did in the freezing cold, trying to call attention to the ERA in Lafayette Park in front of the White House to make our voices heard. And he did release a statement. There's 2 other sections of the Equal Rights Amendment. Section 2 is much like other amendments. It says that Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. And Section 3 reads, this amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification. And so we were celebrating that 2-year milestone and hoping that the ERA would be published then. And that was put into place merely to let states have the time and the resources and the money to update their codes to root out any forms of gender discrimination. And so that's where we are, and that's what we can do. And really, we need to call on everyone who believes that equality is a fundamental principle we should all have and be born with. And by the way, I should say that we are the only industrialized country in the world without an Equal Rights Amendment clause or an Equal Rights clause in its Constitution. And yet, we are supposed to be the best democracy in the world. And I often wonder how we can hold ourselves out to other countries when we talk about the Iranian women or the women of Afghanistan. We should be setting an example to the world, and we're really not.
So I heard that there's some feminists who are against the passing of the ER. What are like some of the feminist arguments against the Equal Rights Amendment?
I don't know that I would call those feminist arguments. They are certainly antis or the opposition. It's hard to call yourself a feminist, which really means equal rights, right? The word feminist is the female F word, they say. The word feminist is really about equality. So I don't think you can be a feminist and be opposed to equal rights for women or the Equal Rights Amendment. And by the way, we are saying that the Equal Rights Amendment is the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. But some of the arguments are unfortunately, around abortion. They think that the ERA, the only reason to have the ERA is to put forth an agenda that eradicates all pro-life activities. And the other criticism, and it seems to always come down, I used the technical term poop earlier, and it seems to, I'm sorry, always come down to poop. They are really concerned about where people go to the bathroom. They are really concerned about sharing bathrooms. And now it's become about women's sports. And for many of us, let's tackle the locker room bathroom issue for a second. Do you fly on a plane? If so, you have to share a bathroom. Do you eat in restaurants or stay in hotels where there are unisex bathrooms? Do you have trouble sharing a bathroom with your spouse of the opposite sex or even the same sex? I don't know why bathrooms are such a hot topic, and they were in the 70s and they are again today in the 2020s. And it's a crime.
Well, wait, you're against bathrooms being separated from men and women? I'm not talking about a single occupancy, but you mean like just like, you know, the women's bathroom, the men's bathroom?
No, I'm not against them at all. I'm just saying I was asked what the opposition thinks.
Okay.
And the opposition is worried about bathrooms. They are worried about where folks are doing their business. And they are worried about something like 5, 6, 7% of the population that are transgender.
Okay.
And they are putting a lot of blame on the transgender folks, unfortunately, who are already marginalized and experience, you know, so much violence, who, you know, would be impacted by the Equal Rights Amendment. And you know, the truth is, the Equal Rights Amendment, once enshrined in the Constitution, it's going to take courts to interpret it and apply it to laws on the books and to people bringing cases before any precedent is set. So again, enshrining the Equal Rights Amendment is enshrining the principle of equality for all, that we are all equally treated, equally paid, are free from violence, and, you know, can live our lives in the most productive ways possible without being held back. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, I hope I don't mess up her quote, but I might, you know, they just need to take their feet off our necks.
Well, let me play devil's advocate. So right now you have women's business loans for specifically women. You have set-asides, you know, like California, where a certain percentage of the boards on companies, publicly traded companies, have to be women. What do you say to people who say that can go away because of the ERA? We
don't think that will be the case. That's what I say. Women, you know, before it was about the draft. Women are already signing up and going to war. The draft, you know, hasn't been used in how long? And there's nothing in the Equal Rights Amendment that even suggests that prisoners of different sexes, different genders would be sharing the same cells, much less the same bathrooms. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, in her infinite wisdom, you know, argued, I think one of her first cases or early cases before the Supreme Court, that was about making certain that a man was entitled to Social Security benefits, almost arguing in the alternative, if you will, as much as a woman is entitled to Social Security benefits when her spouse dies. It's the same kind of thing. So until we get gender parity on corporate boards, until we get gender parity in every level of government, I want to be like Nevada, where there are more women in the state legislature than there are men, right? And women of color are well represented. We don't see that across the nation. We don't see that in until this 50-50 cabinet. When I was working on the Biden domestic policy team, we talked a lot about Biden for president domestic policy team. We talked a lot about a 50-50 cabinet and the importance of having a representative cabinet that looked like the people of America. And so that's great. Until we get to that point, I don't think any of that is going to go away. And it may not even go away once we reach gender parity and we reduce violence against women and we have equal pay. I think these are just fear-mongering tactics to scare folks and make them think that the ERA is actually nefarious when it's a very good and necessary thing.
I guess I have one more question, and it's so the word sex was used in the original ERA. Our understanding of sex and gender has changed in society. Would the language of the ERA be able to remain sex, or would it have to be changed to gender? Or what is your opinion about how we look at sex nowadays versus when it was originally written?
Well, the Supreme Court has already ruled on that and said that the word sex encompasses all genders. And so I don't think we need to have any concern about what that word means. We understand it to mean women, men, LGBTQIA. It's inclusive of all. So I'm not really concerned. And I don't think others should be about the word sex. And some folks will use it as an excuse to say, oh, we need to do the whole thing over. We need to rewrite it and include the word woman. The idea is that the ERA is intersectional and inclusive. And I don't know about you all, but I don't want to wait another 100 years and do this all over again. It's fine the way that it is, as long as we get good court cases out of it that support women, that support vulnerable populations, and offer them more protections so that we all have equal protections under the law.
So I guess one last question, and you kind of answered it before, but what can people do to get this issue out there and to educate people, and what can they do in general?
Write op-eds if that's your thing. Write letters. Again, going back to op-eds, try to publish things, post them on your social media accounts. I do it all the time. The only reason I have social media, I didn't have it when I joined this fight for the ERA. I maybe had a Facebook account way back when Facebook started, and had 300 of people I knew from junior high and high school on it. But I was told you need to get on social media. I was like, oh, it's the bane of my existence. But I did it for the ERA. And I continue to post about it, to educate folks, spread the word, and share what we're doing, because it's hard work. And we need many more voices than just mine or yours, Rose, or Tasha's. We need many more people in this fight. And as I said before, and I'm more than happy to say again, there needs to be a demand that cannot be refused. People need to be screaming from the mountaintops for equality, for the Equal Rights Amendment, and need to understand the significance of it, and that it goes directly to our humanity, to basic humanity. Basic, ordinary equality is what Alice Paul had in mind when the ERA was written. And I'll say too that when they wrote the 19th Amendment, if you have a moment to Google, look at the 19th Amendment side by side with the Equal Rights Amendment. And once they were successful in achieving the 19th Amendment, Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman said, wow, okay, we've achieved women's suffrage. Women, well, some women at the time, let's face it, can vote. Now we should fight for full equality. And the 19th Amendment, in their mind, was meant to be a stepping stone to women's full equality. And so the Equal Rights Amendment really mirrors the language of the 19th Amendment, saying that, you cannot be denied the ability to vote, cannot be denied or abridged on account of sex. It's the same thing, except for that it says equality of rights cannot be denied or abridged. So it was hard to get the 19th Amendment, but even harder to get the Equal Rights Amendment. And you wouldn't think that tweaking a few words would cause all this hubbub and crazy opposition, where some of the folks in the hearing on Tuesday, the first U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee hearing in almost 40 years for the Equal Rights Amendment, was held last week. And you had some people, even some young people, a lot of young people actually, wearing T-shirts that said, stop erasing, and then the ERA in erasing, right? It was, right?
Yes.
Stop erasing us, using ERA. And the whole idea isn't about erasing us or forgetting about our differences and not relishing in our uniqueness as women to men. It's about celebrating it, but giving us protections, leveling the playing field, giving us strict scrutiny rather than intermediate scrutiny, which is what terms used in the Supreme Court, that it makes for a higher level of review for cases.
Yeah, and also, when you read the opinion about the overthrowing of Roe v. Wade, they basically said that, well, women are not protected in the Constitution, and privacy is not in there, therefore it doesn't count. So yeah, having women explicitly, there's no confusion, there's no room for interpretation, it's just there.
Right. And so we can't, what this court showed us is that we can't really trust them, and we can't really trust, that's a really important point, Rose. I'm glad you bring that up. We can't really trust 50-year-long precedent. In fact, what other precedent is going to fall? Is it contraception next? Is it gay marriage? What other rights are going to fall back, are going to be rolled back and taken away from us, rather? If we're going to create constitutional amendments or laws, but particularly constitutional amendments, I sort of said this at the outset, it seems to me, at least for the time being, this particular court for the next 30 to 50 years while they sit, is going to read the text of existing amendments in the U.S. Constitution. And if things are not explicitly stated, which is called originalism or textualism, meaning the exact words on the page, that this court is not going to read in anything extra, any extra protections, such as privacy, for example, which gave us the right to choose. So it's very concerning, because it leaves really little room for interpretation. And a lot of people will say a lot of the law that we rely on in the Constitution is in something called the penumbras of the Constitution, hidden in the sort of the shadows of the Constitution and established by precedent, cases brought over time that have established that precedent. And this Supreme Court, this SCOTUS, threw the baby out with the bathwater and said, nope, we're not having it. And unless it's explicitly stated, you don't get it. We're done. And sort of wipe their hands of it.
Any last words?
If anybody needs a briefing, if anybody wants to get involved, I'm happy to have them reach out to me. I'm Lisa Sales. You can find me on the vanow.org website. and happy to help with FAQs, happy to get more and more folks involved. And we do need our male allies. So it's equally as important to involve them and involve our children, you know, talk about it in the school setting, at PTA meetings, whenever we have an opportunity to talk about and raise up equal rights as human rights. I think we should take that opportunity. So happy to help anyone who wants to learn more, anyone who wants to get involved. Again, they can go to vanow.org and we have a contact form, or they can email info@vanow.org.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite. Love you all.
Thank you, Lisa. That was good. Very informative. Thank you so much.